But before pointing out what is common to both, we justified in the conclusion that the first of these two systems is necessarily a copy of the other. One word would suffice for the solution of this question were we content with a superficial criticism, for we would have no trouble to establish, and we did establish in the first part of this book, that the secret doctrine of the Hebrews existed long before Ammonius Saccas, for 17, Plotinus for 18, and Porphyrius for 19 changed the aspect of philosophy. But compelled by weighty reasons, we would rather admit that it took the Kabbalah several centuries to develop and establish itself in its definite state. The supposition that the Kabbalah borrowed a great deal from the pagan school of Alexandria remained since then in full force, and merits therefore our serious consideration, especially so when we bear in mind that after the revolution brought about in the Orient by the Macedonian armies, many Jews adopted the language and the civilization of their conquerors. We must start from the already proven fact, see Part 1, a fact that will show itself still clearer as we go along, that the Kabbalah came to us from Palestine, as attested by its close connection with the rabbinical institutions. For the Jews of Alexandria spoke Greek, and in no case would they have made use of the popular and corrupt idiom of the Holy Land. Now, what relations do we meet with between these countries and the civilizations they represent, from the time the Neoplatonic school made its appearance until the middle of the 4th century, a period during which Judea witnessed the dying of its last schools, of its last patriarchs, and of the last sparks of its intellectual and religious life? For 20 had the pagan philosophy penetrated the Holy Land during this lapse of time, it would naturally imply the intervention of the Alexandrian Jews, to whom during a course of several centuries the principal monuments of the Greek civilization were as familiar as the holy books, a fact borne out by the Septuagint and the example of Aristobulus. But the Alexandrian Jews had so little communication with their Palestinian brethren that they completely ignored the rabbinical institutions which played such a great role with the latter, and which, for more than 2 centuries before the Common Era, were already deeply rooted in them. For 21, when the works of Philo, the Book of Wisdom, and the last book of the Maccabees, both of which flowed from an Alexandrian pen, are scrutinized carefully, we find no mention there of any of the names which stand in Judea for the most sacred authority, as that of the high priest Simon the Just, the last representative of the great synagogue, for 22, and those of the Tannaim who succeeded him in veneration by the people. We never find there even an allusion to the famous disputes of Hillel and Shammai for 23, nor to the different customs which were collected later in the Mishnah, and which attained legal power. In his work, Life of Moses, for 24, Philo does mention an oral tradition which has been preserved by the elders of Israel, and which was usually studied with the text of the scriptures. But this tradition, even if not accidentally invented to interweave at pleasure fables in the life of the Hebrew prophets, has nothing in common with the traditions which form the basis of the rabbinical cult. It reminds us of the Midrashim, or those popular, unauthoritative legends which abound in Judaism at every epoch of its history. The Palestinian Jews, again, were no better informed of what happened with their scattered brethren in Egypt. They knew only from hearsay the pretended version of the Septuagint which dates from a much earlier epoch than the one holding our attention at present. They eagerly accepted the fable of Aristes for 25, which harmonized so well with their national self-love and with their inclination to the marvelous. For 26, not a word is found in the Mishnah and in the 2 Gemaras which would be applicable either to the philosopher Aristobulus, to Philo, or to the author of the apocryphal books mentioned before. Still more surprising is the fact that the Talmud never mentions either the Therapeuti, for 27, or even the Essenes, for 28, for 29, although the latter were already well established in the Holy Land during the life of the historian Josephus. Such silence can be explained only by the origin of these two sects and by the language they employed for the transmission of their doctrines. Both were brought forth in Egypt, and probably kept up the use of the Greek language, even upon the soil of their religious fatherland. The silence of the Talmud, especially with regard to the Essenes, would otherwise be still more unexplainable, for, according to Josephus, these sects were known already during the reign of John Attas Maccabeus, 150 years before the Christian era. For 30, can we possibly believe that the Jews of Palestine knew much more of what was going on in the pagan schools, equally distant, while they were so ignorant of matters pertaining to their own brethren, some of whom they could justly have been proud of? We have already said that they held the Greek language in high esteem, but were they sufficiently familiar with it to enable them to follow the philosophic trend of their time? We are perfectly justified in doubting this. For, above all, we find neither trace nor mention in either Talmud for 31 or Zohar of any monument of the Greek civilization. How, then, is it possible to understand a language when the works it produced are not known? Then again, we learn from Josephus himself, Pt.2, who was born in Palestine, and who spent most of his life there, that this famous historian required help for the writing, or rather, for the translating of his works into Greek. At another place in his works Pt.3 he expresses himself still more explicitly on this subject, applying in general to his compatriots what he says of himself. He then adds that the study of languages is looked upon in his country as a profane occupation, worthy rather of slaves than of free people, and that, finally, only those are held there in great esteem and called savants who are very highly proficient in the knowledge of the religious laws of the Holy Scriptures. And yet Josephus belonged to one of the most distinguished families. Of royal blood and of priestly rank, no one was more fit to be initiated in all the knowledge of the land, in the religious knowledge as well as in that which prepares one of noble birth for a political life. In devoting himself to the profane studies, the author of the Jewish Antiquities, and of the Jewish War, was not subject to the same scruples as his compatriots who remained true to their country and to their belief. Pt.4 admitting even that the Greek language was much more cultivated in Palestine than we are justified in thinking, we are still far from drawing any conclusion therefrom upon the influence of the Alexandrian philosophy, for the Talmud makes a clear distinction between the Greek language and what it calls the Greek science. Pt.5, Greek science for itself, Greek language for itself, as much as the first was respected and honored, so much was the latter execrated. The Mishnah, which, as a collection of legal decisions, expresses itself very concisely, confines itself to prohibiting the bringing up of children in Greek learning. It adds, however, that this interdiction was carried out during the war with Titus. Pt.36 the Gemara, though, is more explicit and sets that interdiction at an earlier date. The following, it says, has been taught us by our masters, during the war which raged between the Hasmonean princes. Hyrcanus laid siege to Jerusalem, and Aristobulus was the besieged. Pt.37, 438 a chest full of coins was lowered every day along the outer wall, and in exchange thereof the animals required for sacrifices were sent up. Pt.39 now, in the camp of the besieger there was an old man who was at home in the Greek learning. He said, as long as your enemies are having the means to hold divine service, they will not fall into your hands. When on the following day the chest full of coin was lowered as usual, a pig was sent up instead of the sacrificial animal. When halfway up the rampart, the unclean animal dug its nails into the wall and the land of Israel trembled 400 parasangs, Persian miles, around. At that time the following curse was pronounced, Cursed be he who raises pigs, cursed be he who imparts Greek learning to his children. 440 barring the fabulous and ridiculous account of the earthquake, this account is valuable for the critic. The gist is apparently true, for it is also found in Josephus' Jewish Antiquities, Volume 14, Chapter 3. According to him Hyrcanus' men promised to give to the besieged sacrificial animals at 1 drachma per head, but when the money was delivered they refused to send the animals. This was considered by the Jews as doubly odious, for, according to Josephus, it violated not only the sworn trust in man, but it struck in some way God himself. When we add to it the very probable new circumstance that the priests saw coming into the holy place an animal so utterly disgusting to them instead of the impatiently expected sacrifice, we can see the measure of blasphemy and perjury overflowing. Now then, who was responsible for such a crime? Where are we to look for the first impulse? Surely with those who neglected the law of God for the wisdom of other nations. Whether or not this accusation be well-founded, is of little importance. Whether the anathema, justified or caused by that accusation, was pronounced during the Hasmonean War or during the War of Titus, is of still less importance to us. What does interest us, though, and what seems to us also beyond doubt, is the fact that Greek learning was looked upon in Palestine as a source of impiety, and constituted in itself a double sacrilege, no matter what degree it attained there. No sympathy, no alliance, therefore, could take place between those who were suspected of it and the founders and keepers of rabbinical orthodoxy. In the name of Rabbi Judah, who heard from an older teacher Samuel, the Talmud really gives us the following words of Simon, the son of Gamaliel, who played such a beautiful part in the Acts of the Apostles. There were 1,000 children in the home of my father, 500 studied the law, and 500 were instructed in Greek learning. Today only myself here and the son of my father S for 41 brother in Asia for 42 remain. To this objection the Gemara responds with, an exception is made with the family of Gamaliel because it was close to the royal court. 443 Let us note, besides, that the entire passage is far from offering the same character as the previous one. We do not deal here with a general tradition for 44 but with a simple hearsay of an individual witness who is already far removed from the source. 445 Gamaliel's character, as pictured by tradition, is best distinguished from that of the other teachers of the law by his very attachment to the orthodox wing of Judaism and by the general respect he inspired. For 46 it will be seen that such sentiments are not easily compatible with the accusation of impiety made against the Hellenists. For 47 what is more, this patriarch of the synagogue, quite aged already at the time of the apostles, had been dead a long time when the school of Alexandria was founded. Finally, since the house of Gamaliel was an exception, the fact, whatever it may be, should have disappeared with the cause, and we really do not find later the least trace of it. Offsetting this obscure and uncertain text, we find another text which is in perfect accord with the strict terms of the Mishnah. Ben Domer asked his uncle Rabbi Ismael, having studied all of the law, may I also study Greek science? The teacher cited the following verse to him, the hook of the law shall not quit thy mouth, and thou shalt ponder over it day and night. Now then, he added, find an hour which is neither day nor night, and I shall permit you to devote it to the study of Greek science. For 48 the hypothesis that the Alexandrian philosophy found disciples among the teachers of Judea is totally overthrown by the passages previously quoted, and we do not know of any other, which justify our opinion that they did not even know the word philosophy. For 49 indeed, how can that old man who advised Hyrcanus to use against the enemy the exigencies of the cult, his own cult, be considered a philosopher? Such a policy would be worthy rather of a Machiavelli. How can philosophy be counted among the attainments necessary for the admission to the court of Herod? When we consult the oldest and most celebrated commentator, Solomon bar Isaac, for 50, Rashi, for 51 our opinion is confirmed. By Greek science, he says, the Talmud understands a scholastic language spoken by the courtiers and not understood by the people in general. For 52 this explanation, although very sensible, is perhaps a little narrow, but, to be sure, the doubtful expression to which it refers cannot designate for 53 anything but a certain general culture, or rather, a certain intellectual liberty brought about by the influence of Greek literature. While the religious traditions of the Jews show such hatred towards any wisdom coming from the Greeks, it is evident from the following passage with what enthusiasm, with what adoration and with what superstitious fear they speak of the Kabbalah. Our teacher for 54 Yohanan ben Zakkai for 55 once took to the road, mounted on an ass and accompanied by Rabbi Eliezer ben Arak. The latter asked ben Zakkai to teach him a chapter of the Merkabah. Did I not tell you, answered our teacher, that it is forbidden to expound the Merkabah even to one person unless he be wise and can deduce wisdom of his own accord? For 56 then permit me at least, replied Eliezer, to repeat in your presence what you taught me of this science. Very well, speak, replied again our teacher, and thus saying he alighted from the ass, covered his head and sat upon a stone in the shade of an olive tree. Eliezer, son of Arak, had hardly begun to speak of the Merkabah, when a fire descended from heaven and enveloped all the trees of the field, which seemed to sing hymns, and from the fire there was heard the voice of an angel who expressed his joy at listening to these secrets. 457 later on, when two other teachers attempted to imitate the example of Eliezer, they were struck by miracles of no less astonishing a character. Dark clouds suddenly covered the sky, a rainbow-like meteor dazzled on the horizon, and the angels were seen hastening to listen, like a curious crowd gathering to witness a wedding march. For 58 is it still possible to think, after reading these lines, that the Kabbalah is but a ray pilfered from the son of Alexandrian philosophy? However, we cannot help acknowledging that there exist certain resemblances between the Kabbalah and the Neoplatonism of Alexandria which are impossible to account for except by a common origin, and this origin, perhaps, we shall have to look for elsewhere than in Judea and Greece. We need not point out here that the school of Ammonius, like the school of Simeon ben Yohai, also shrouded itself in mystery, and also resolved never to divulge the secrets of its doctrines. Porphyrius, Life of Plotinus, that through the medium of their last disciples, at least, they too passed themselves for the inheritors of an ancient and mysterious tradition which emanated, necessarily, from a divine source. For 59 that they knew and applied in the same manner allegorical interpretations. For 60. And, finally, that they put the pretentious enlightenment of enthusiasm and faith above reason. 461 These then are the claims common to all kinds of mysticism. We shall not dwell upon them and delay thereby our getting sooner to the following, more important points. 1. God is to Plotinus and his disciples, as well as to the adepts of the Kabbalah, the immanent cause of the substantial origin of things. Everything comes from him, and everything returns to him. He is the beginning and the end of all that is. Verse 62 He is, as Porphyrius says, everywhere and nowhere. He is everywhere, because all beings are in him and through him. He is nowhere, for he is neither in any particular existence, nor in the sum of all existences. 463 He is so far from being the union of all individual existences, that he is even, says Plotinus, above existence, in which he sees but one of his manifestations. If he is superior to existence, he is equally superior to intelligence which, emanating necessarily from him, cannot reach him. Then again, although he is generally called the unity, or the first, it would be more appropriate to give him no name at all, for there is no name that can express his essence. He is the ineffable, the unknown. For 64 This is exactly the status of the Ein Sof, which is always called by the Zohar the unknown of the unknown, the mystery of mysteries, and which is placed by it far above the Sephiroth, even above those which represent existence in the highest degree of abstraction. 2. According to the Alexandrian Platonics, God can be conceived only in the form of a trinity. There is first a general trinity that is composed of the following three expressions which have been borrowed from the language of Plato: the unity or the good, the intelligence and the soul of the world, or the demiurge. 465 But each of these three expressions gives birth to a particular trinity. The good or the unity, in its relations to the beings, is at the same time the principle of all love, or the object of universal desire, the fullness of power and possession, and, finally, the highest perfection. As the possessor of the fullness of power, God tends to manifest himself outwardly, to become the creating cause. As the object of love and desire, he attracts to him all that is, and becomes the final cause, and as the type of highest perfection, he changes these arrangements into an efficient virtue, the beginning and end of all existence. For 66 This first trinity is called the goodness itself. Next follows the intelligible trinity, or divine wisdom, in whose bosom rest and unite, in its most perfect identity, existence, truth, and intelligible truth, that is to say, the thinking object, the object thought of and the thought itself. For 67 For 68 Finally, the soul of the world, or the demiurge, may also be considered a trinity, the demiurgic trinity. It includes the universal substance or the universal power which acts in all nature, the motion or generation of beings, and their return to the bosom of the substance that produced them. For 69 These three aspects of nature may be replaced by three others which represent in a symbolic manner as many Olympic deities. Jupiter is the universal demiurge of the souls and bodies. For 70 Neptune reigns over the souls and Pluto over the bodies. These three particular trinities, which blend and lose themselves in some way in a general trinity, do not differ much from the classification of the divine attributes as represented in the Zohar. For we must not forget that all the Sephiroth are divided into three categories which, in their totality, also form a general and indivisible trinity. The first three bear a purely intellectual character, those following bear a moral character, and the last relate to God as beheld in nature. 3. In the same manner the generation of beings, or the manifestation of God's attributes, is shown by the two systems we are comparing. As we have said before, the doctrine of Plotinus and Proclus teaches that the intelligence is the very essence of the being, and that the being and the intelligence are absolutely identical in the bosom of unity. It therefore follows that all existences of which the world is composed, and all the aspects under which we may consider them, are but the development of the absolute thought, or a kind of a creative dialectic which produces simultaneously light, reality and life. 471 For nothing ever separates itself absolutely from the principle or from the highest unity which is always immutable and self-resembling. It includes all the beings and all the forces which we distinguish in the world. In the lower degrees, finally, the multiplicity and number extends infinitely. For 72 But the intelligible essence of things gradually weakens at the same time, until it sinks to a mere negation. In this state it becomes matter, which is called by Porphyrius 473, the absence of all existence, or true nothing, non-ends, and more poetically represented by Plotinus as the image of shadows which limit our knowledge, and which are given an intelligible form by our soul's reflection therein. 474 Let us recall two remarkable passages in the Zohar where thought, united at first with the being in perfect identity, successively produces all creatures and all divine attributes by continually causing its self-consciousness to change and become more distinct. The elements themselves, I mean the material elements and the different conditions which we observe in space, are among the things which it eternally produces from its own bosom. See Part 2, near end. All the metaphors, therefore, which represent the supreme principle of things as a source of light which emanates, inexhaustibly and eternally, rays of light that reveal its presence in all conditions of infinity, are not always to be taken literally, whether met with in the Hebrew or in the Alexandrian doctrine. Light, says Proclus expressly, Theol, secund. Plato, Liv. 2, Chapter 4, is here nothing else but the intelligence or the participation of divine intelligence. The inexhaustible source from which it flows unceasingly, is the absolute unity which unites in its bosom the being and the thought. For 75 it would be useless to repeat here, for the sake of the Neoplatonic school, all we have said in the analysis of the Zohar about the human soul and its union with God through faith and love. All mystic systems necessarily agree on this point, for it may be regarded as the basis, the very foundation of mysticism. We shall now choose this hasty parallel by asking whether it is really possible to explain such deep and continuous resemblances in a train of thought, which is hardly accessible to most intelligences, by the identity of human faculties, or by the general laws of thought. On the other hand, we believe to have sufficiently demonstrated that the teachers of Palestine could not have drawn from the Greek civilization, a civilization so accursed and so anathematized by them, a science of greater importance even than the study of the law. With due respect to the critic, we cannot even admit that the Greek philosophers could have made profitable use of the Jewish tradition. For, while Numenius and Longinus speak of Moses, while the author of the Egyptian Mysteries, for 76 whoever he may have been, admits angels and archangels into his theological system, it is probably because of the version of the Septuagint, or because of the relations that exist between these three philosophers and the Hellenistic Jews of Egypt. It would be absurd to draw the conclusion that they were initiated in the formidable mysteries of the Merkabah. We are, therefore, to inquire yet whether there exists an older doctrine from which, unknown to each other, both the Kabbalistic system as well as the so-called Alexandrian Platonism, sprang. There is no need of leaving the capital of the Ptolemies for this purpose, for right in the bosom of the Jewish nation we find a man who may be judged in different ways, it is true, but who always enjoys splendid fame for 77, a man who is generally looked upon by the historians of philosophy as the true founder of the Alexandrian school, while by some critics and by most of the modern historians of Judaism he is considered the inventor of Hebrew mysticism. This man is Philo. It is, then, his system, as far as there may be one, that we shall now make the object of our investigation, and endeavor to discover in his opinions and in his numerous writings the first traces of the Kabbalah. I say, Kabbalah, only, for the relations of Philo to the pagan philosophical schools which have been founded after him, will become apparent of themselves. Besides, no matter how worthy of interest the origin of this philosophy may be in the present work, it need but be of secondary consideration. Chapter 3. Relation of the Kabbalah to the doctrine of Philo. Without repeating what has been said before of the relative isolation of the Jews of Palestine and those of Egypt, we may add that Philo's name is never mentioned by the Jewish writers of the Middle Ages. Neither Sodia 478 nor Maimonides 479, neither their later disciples nor the modern Kabbalists, have dedicated any monument to him, and even now he is barely known among those of his co-religionists who are strangers to the Greek literature. 480 We shall not linger, though, upon these external facts, the importance of which we do not wish to exaggerate. As we have hinted before, we shall look for the solution of our problem in our philosophers' own opinions, which have been made clear by the labors of modern criticism. For 81 There is nothing in the writings of Philo that can possibly be called a system. Incongruous opinions in disorderly juxtaposition. I refer to the symbolic interpretation of the Holy Scriptures serve a most arbitrary method. All the elements of this chaos which are held together by one common bond, the innate desire of the author to demonstrate in the Hebrew writings the presence of the highest and purest in the wisdom of other nations, may be divided into two big classes. The elements of one class have been borrowed from the philosophic systems of Greece, systems which are not irreconcilable with the fundamental principles of any moral or religious teaching, like that of Pythagoras, Aristotle and Zeno, 482, but above all that of Plato, whose language and ideas make up the first sketch, so to speak, in all the writings of the Hebrew philosopher. The elements of the other class visibly betray, by the contempt they instill for reason and science, by the impatience with which they precipitate in some manner the human soul into the bosom of the infinite, their foreign origin, and can come only from the Orient. This dualism of the Philonic ideas is of the greatest importance, not only for the problem we are to solve, but for the history of philosophy in general, and we shall first of all endeavor to determine it definitely, at least, on the points most salient and most worthy of our interest. When speaking of the creation and of the first principles of beings, of God and of his relations to the universe, Philo has evidently two doctrines in mind, doctrines that can never be brought in accord by any effort of logic. One doctrine is simply the dualism of Plato as taught in Timaeus, the other reminds us at once of Plotinus and the Kabbalah. We shall take up the first doctrine which, singularly, is placed in the mouth of Moses, the legislator of the Hebrews, says our author in his treatise on the creation, 483, recognized two equally necessary principles, one active and the other passive. The first is the highest and absolute intelligence which is above virtue, above knowledge, above the good and the beautiful itself. The second is the inert and inanimate matter which became perfect by receiving motion, form and life from intelligence. To avoid taking the last principle as a pure abstraction, Philo takes care to repeat in another work 484 the famous maxim of pagan antiquity, that there is neither absolute beginning nor absolute annihilation, but that the same elements pass from one form to another. These elements are earth, water, air, and fire. We are taught that, in order to make the world a work fully accomplished and worthy of the supreme architect, God left no particle outside of the world. 485 But before giving form to matter and existence to this sensual universe, God visualized in his thought the intelligible universe or the prototypes, the incorruptible ideas of things. 486 Divine kindness, which is the only cause of the formation of the world. 487 explains also why the world should not perish. God cannot, without discontinuing his goodness, wish to replace order and general harmony by chaos, and to imagine a better world which is some day to replace ours, is to accuse God of having failed in his goodness towards the present order of things. 488 According to this system the generation of beings, or the application of the power which formed the universe, must have necessarily commenced, but it cannot continue to act endlessly, for God cannot destroy the already formed world by producing another, matter cannot return to general chaos. Moreover, God is not the immanent cause of the beings, neither is he the creative cause in the modern theological sense. He is only the supreme architect, the demiurge, and this is really the term Philo makes use of when he is under the influence of the Greek philosophy. 489 Finally, God is not only above, but completely apart from the creation, the posteritate caeni, for, possessing infinite knowledge and felicity, he can have no relation to a formless and unclean substance as matter is. 490 Let us now try to harmonize these principles with the following doctrines. God never rests in his works, but it is his nature always to produce, just as it is the nature of fire to burn, and that of snow to diffuse cold. 491 Rest, as applied to God, does not mean inactivity, for the active cause of the universe can never cease to produce the most beautiful works. But we say that God rests, because his endless activity works spontaneously, without pain and without fatigue. For 92 It is also absurd to take literally the words of the scriptures which tell us that the world was created in 6 days. Far from lasting but 6 days, creation did not even commence in time. For, according to Plato, time itself was created with other things, and is but a fleeting image of eternity. For 93 Divine action, as was said before, does not only give form to inert matter, and causes the departure of all the elements necessary for the formation of the world from disorder and darkness, but it becomes really creative and absolute. It is limited neither in space nor in time. In giving rise to things, says Philo expressly, God did not only make them visible, but he produced what did not exist before. He is not only the architect, the demiurge, of the universe, he is also its creator. 494 He is the principle of all action in each particular being, as well as in the totality of things, for to him alone belongs activity. Passivity is in the nature of all things engendered. For 95 It is probably because of this that everything is filled with and penetrated by his presence, and it is also because of this that he does not permit anything to stay void of and abandoned by him. 496 But as there is nothing that can embrace the infinite, he is, therefore, nowhere and everywhere at the same time, an antithesis which we heard already from the mouth of Porphyrius, and which was understood in the same sense as it was later understood by the disciples of Plotinus. God is nowhere because place and space were created with the bodies, and we cannot therefore say that the Creator is confined in the creature. He is everywhere because he penetrates simultaneously, by his various potencies, earth and water, air and heaven. 497 He fills the least particle of the universe, uniting each other by invisible bonds. 498 But this is not enough. God himself is the place of the universe, for he embraces all things, he is the shelter of the universe and his own seat, the place wherein he confines himself and where he contains himself. 499 When male branch, French Philo 1638-1715, trans, who saw in God the place of spirits only, appears to us so close to Spinoza, what are we to think of one who represents the Supreme Being as the place of all the existences, of the spirits as well as of the bodies? But we must also ask what becomes of this idea of the passive principle of the universe. How are we to conceive as a real and necessary being that matter which has neither form nor activity in itself, which must have existed, and which, together with space, was transported into the bosom of God? And Philo is really driven by an irresistible inclination to pronounce the great words, God is all. Legis, Alleg, I, 1. But how did the Supreme Being cause to spring forth from this intelligible place, which is his own substance, an actual space containing this material and sensual world? How did he, who is all activity and all intelligence, produce passive and inactive beings? The mementos of Greek philosophy are here entirely stifled by the language and the ideas of the Orient. God is the purest light, the prototype and source of all light. He sheds around him innumerable rays of light, all intelligibles, which no creature can behold. 500 But his image is reflected in his thought, in his logos, and it is by this image alone that we can comprehend him. 501 Here we see already a first manifestation, or, as is generally said, a first emanation of divine nature. 4. When the Platonic reminiscence of Philo make way to other influences, the divine word becomes with him a real being, a person or a hypostasis, as it was later said in the Alexandrian school. Of such nature is the archangel who commands all celestial armies. 502 But our philosopher does not stop at this point. From this first logos, ordinarily called the most ancient, the firstborn of God, which represents in the absolute sphere the thought, there emanates another which represents the word, that is to say, the creative power, the manifestation of which is the world. When we read in Genesis that a river went forth from Eden to water the garden, it means that the generic goodness is an emanation of the divine wisdom which is the word of God. 503 The author of this universe should be called both the architect as well as the father of his work. Supreme wisdom we shall call the mother. It is with supreme wisdom that God united in a mysterious manner to make the generation of things operative. Impregnated with the divine germ, supreme wisdom gave birth, in pain and at the appointed time, the only well-beloved Son whom we call the world. It is for this reason that a sacred writer presents to us wisdom as speaking of itself in the following manner: Of all the works of God I was the first to be formed, time was not yet when I already existed. For everything that is engendered must naturally be younger than the mother and the nurse of the universe. 50 For there is a passage in Timaeus where we meet with nearly the same language, but with the vast difference that the mother and nurse of all things is a principle entirely apart from God. It is the inert and formless matter. 505 The quoted passages remind us more of the ideas and the usual expressions of the Zohar. There, too, God is called the eternal light. There, too, the generation of things is metaphorically explained by the gradual darkening of the rays emanating from the divine center, and by the union of God with himself in his diverse attributes. Springing from the bosom of God to give life to the universe, supreme wisdom is also represented by the river which went forth from the earthly paradise. The two logi, finally, remind us of the Kabbalistic principle that the world is nothing but the word of God, that his word or his voice is his thought become visible, and that his thought, finally, is himself. Another picture, often drawn in the principal work of the Kabbalah, shows us the universe as a cloak or garment of God. Now then, we have here the same in the following words of Philo: The Supreme Being is surrounded by a dazzling light which envelops him like a rich cloak, and the most ancient word covers itself with the world as with a garment. 506 Two ways of speaking of God result also from this twofold theory on the nature and birth of things in general when he is considered for himself, in his proper essence and independent of the creation. Sometime he is the supreme reason of things, the active and efficient cause of the universe, the most general idea, legis. Alleg. 2. the intelligible nature. To him alone belongs liberty, knowledge, joy, peace, and happiness, in short perfection. 507 Sometime he is represented higher even than perfection and all possible attributes. Nothing can give us an idea of him, neither virtue nor knowledge, neither beauty nor goodness. 508 Not even unity. For what we call unity is but an image of the first cause. 509, 510 All we know of him is that he exists, to us he is the ineffable and nameless being. 511 We easily recognize in the first case the influence of Plato, of the metaphysics of Aristotle, and even of the physiology of the Stoics. In the second case there is an entirely different order of ideas. Here, the Neoplatonic unity and the Ein Sof of the Kabbalah, the mystery of mysteries, the unknown of the unknown, which dominates both the Sephiroth and the world, are clearly visible. This applies also necessarily to all that Philo, because of his religious belief or because of his philosophic views, presents to us as an intermediary between the things created and the purest essence of God. We refer to the angels, the Word, and in general to what Philo designates under the somewhat vague name of divine powers. When the Greek dualism is taken seriously, when the intelligent principle acts directly upon matter, and God is conceived as the demiurge of the world, then the Word or the Logos is the divine idea, the seat of all ideas after which all things have been patterned. The forces and the messengers of God, that is, the angels of every degree of the celestial hierarchy, the ideas themselves. This viewpoint is expressed already in the following short fragments. If we are to speak prosaically, then the intelligible world is nothing but the thought of God while he prepared himself to create the world, just as an architect who has the ideal city in his mind before constructing the real city according to this plan. Now, just as this ideal city occupies no space, and is but a picture in the mind of the architect, so can the intelligible world be nowhere but in the divine thought where the plan for the material universe was conceived. There is no other place capable of receiving and embracing even a single one of these unadulterated forces, much less all the forces of the Supreme Intelligent. 512 These are the forces which have formed the immaterial and intelligible world, the prototype of the visible and the corporeal world. 513 In another place 514 we are told that the divine forces and the ideas are one and the same, that their task is to give the appropriate form to each object. In the same manner, nearly, the angels are referred to. They represent different particular forms of the everlasting reason or of virtue, and inhabit the divine space, that is to say, the intelligible world. 515 The power upon which they depend directly, or the archangel, is, as we already know, the Logos itself. But this nature of things and these roles are entirely changed when, according to the conception of the author, God appears as the immanent cause and the true place of all beings. In this case we are not dealing any longer with the simple imprint of different forms upon matter that does not exist of its own essence, but, without losing anything of their intelligible value, all ideas become, in addition, substantial realities, active forces subordinated one to another and yet bound in one substance, in one force, in one single intelligence. Wisdom or the Word thus becomes the first of all the heavenly forces, a distinct power, but not separated from the absolute being. 516 The spring that waters and vivifies the earth, the cupbearer of the Most High who pours out the nectar of the souls, and who is itself this nectar. 517 The firstborn of God and the mother of all the beings. 518 It is also called the divine man, for the image in which the earthly man was created on the sixth day, and which the Holy Scriptures call the image of God, is nothing but the everlasting Word. 519 It is the high priest of the universe, that is to say, the conciliator between the finite and the infinite. It may be regarded as a second God without impairing the belief in one God. 520 The Scriptures have it in mind when titles and a name are sometimes bestowed upon God, for the first rank belongs to the ineffable being. 521 Philo's assertion that the Word reveals itself sometimes to a man in a material form fully convinces us that these expressions refer to a real personification. It is the Word that the patriarch Jacob saw in a dream, and it is the Word again that spoke to Moses in the burning bush. Supra. We have already seen how this supreme Word engenders another which springs from its bosom by way of emanation, like a river gushing from its source. This second Word is the goodness, the creative virtue, a hypostatized Platonic idea. Below the goodness is the royal power, which governs with justice all created beings. 522 These three forces, the two last ones of which, when confined in their action to man only, are called mercy and judgment, revealed themselves once upon the earth under the disguise of the three angels who visited Abraham. 5:23 They make up the invisible good and the harmony of this world, just as they are, on the other hand, the glory, the presence of God, whence they descend by a gradual darkening of the infinite splendor, for each one of them is both shadow and light, shadow of that which is above, light and life of all that is below their own sphere. 524 Their essence, finally, is just as impossible to comprehend as that of the primitive being, although their action is present everywhere and their forms manifest themselves in the forms of the universe. It is just what God himself had taught Moses when the latter implored him, says Philo, to show him at least his glory, that is to say, the forces that surround his inaccessible throne, after asking him in vain to see him face to face. 525 The angels which we just saw described as ideas representing different kinds of virtue, are not only personified after the manner of poets and biblical writers, but they are also looked upon as souls floating in ether and sometimes uniting with souls inhabiting human bodies. 526 They form real and animated substances which impart life to all elements and to all parts of nature. Proof of it is the following passage which we shall translate. The beings designated by the philosophers of other nations as demons, are called by Moses angels. These are the souls that float in the air, and no one must deny their existence, for the universe must be animated in all its parts, and each element must be inhabited by living beings. The earth is thus stocked with animals, the sea and rivers with the inhabitants of water, the fire with the salamander supposed to be quite common in Macedonia, the heavens by the stars. In fact, if the stars were not pure and divine souls, they would not be endowed with circular motion which properly belongs to the spirit only. It follows, therefore, that the air must also be peopled by living beings, although our eyes cannot see them. 527 Philo's syncretism shows itself most plainly, and the twofold direction to which he commits himself, notwithstanding his lively predilection for Oriental ideas, is most easily seen, when he comes to speak of man. Thus, unlike Plato, he is not content with seeing the pale imprint of the eternal ideas in material things, but he even maintains that without the help of the senses we can never rise to higher cognition, that without the spectacle of the material world we cannot even suspect the existence of an immaterial and invisible world. 528 He then declares the influence of the senses to be absolutely harmful, and commands man to sever all connections with them and to take refuge within himself. He creates an abyss between the rational, intelligent soul, which alone is privileged to constitute man, and the sentient soul from which our organs borrow life as well as the knowledge appropriate to them. This soul resides, as Moses said, in the blood. 529 While the other is an emanation, an inseparable reflection of divine nature. 530 This exaggerated viewpoint does not prevent him from retaining the Platonic opinion which recognizes in the human soul three elements, the thought, the will and the passions. 531 In innumerable places he insists upon the necessity of preparing for wisdom by what he calls encyclical sciences, that is to say, by oratory and those sciences which produce that outward culture so dear to the Greeks. Our mind, he says, must be fed with this mundane knowledge before it can aspire to higher science, just as our body must be fed with milk before it can bear more substantial food. 532 Anyone neglecting to acquire these must succumb in this world as Abel succumbed to the blows of his fratricidal brother. In another place he teaches entirely to the contrary. The word and the outward appearance is to be scorned, just as the body and the senses are to be scorned, that we may live in the intelligence and in the contemplation of the naked truth only. God's command to Abraham to leave his country, his family, and the house of his father, means that man must break away from his body, his senses, and the word. For the body is but part of the earth where we are forced to live, the senses are the servants and the brothers of the thought, and the word, finally, is but the cover and, in some measure, the dwelling place of the intelligence which is our real father. De Somniis, L. 1. The same thought is symbolically reproduced in a more expressive manner by Hagar and Ishmael. This rebellious servant and her son, who were so ignominiously driven from the house of their master, represent the encyclical knowledge and the sophism it begets. It is hardly necessary to add that anyone aspiring to a higher level of the spiritual world must imitate the Hebrew patriarch. 533 But does the soul, when fully retired in the intelligence, find there, at least, self-satisfaction and the means of arriving through its own efforts to truth and wisdom? Had Philo answered this question in the affirmative, he would no have gone beyond the doctrine of Plato. For in Plato's estimation only he is truly wise who entirely renounces body and senses, and labors hard all his life to learn how to die. Phaedon, adinit. But our Alexandrian philosopher oversteps this boundary, for, besides the knowledge borrowed from reason, besides the enlightenment given by philosophy, he is also in need of enlightenment and of higher knowledge, emanating directly from God, and given to intelligence as a favor, a mysterious gift. When we read in the scriptures, he says, that God spoke to man, we are not to believe that a material voice vibrated the air, but that the human soul had been illumined by the purest light. In this manner only can the divine word address itself to man. Again, when the law was promulgated on the Mount Sinai, it is not said that a voice was heard, but, according to the text, a voice was seen by all the people assembled. You have seen, says Jehovah, that I spoke to you from heaven above. 5:34. Since a miracle is explained, it cannot refer here to rational knowledge or to a mere contemplation of ideas but to a revelation mystically understood. We shall give the same meaning to another passage where the possibility of grasping God himself through direct manifestation is admitted, instead of rising to him by the contemplation of his works. In this state, adds our author, we understand at a glance the essence of God, his word, and the universe. 5:35. He recognizes faith, which he calls the queen of virtues, as the most perfect of all goodness, the cement that unites us with divine nature. 5:36. It is faith that is represented in the story of Judah and Tamar, for as he united himself with her without lifting the veil that covered her face, so does faith unite us with God. Philo shows the same hesitation when speaking of human liberty as when explaining the nature and origin of our knowledge. At times the Stoic doctrine that man is free triumphs. The laws of necessity which govern without exception all other creatures, do not exist for man. This free choice, then, which is his privilege, imposes upon him at the same time the responsibility for his actions. Only thus is man alone among all other beings capable of virtue, and hereby alone are we justified in saying that God, in his desire to manifest himself in the universe through the idea of goodness, found no more dignified a temple than the human soul. 5:37. But it is easily seen that this theory, so true and wise, contradicts certain general principles previously expounded, as the unity of substance, the formation of beings by way of emanation, and even the Platonic dualism. Our philosopher has also no scruples in deserting this theory for opposite views, and it is readily noted that he finds himself there more at ease, and that he unfolds there much better the wealth of his half-Oriental style and the resources of his natural genius. He takes there from man his free choice as well as his moral responsibility. The evil we attribute to ourselves as the one generally reigning in this world, is the inevitable fruit of matter. 5:38. Or the work of inferior forces which took part with the divine logos in the formation of man. The good, on the contrary, belongs to God alone. It is really because it does not suit the Supreme Being to participate in evil, that he called for subordinate workers to cooperate with him in the creation of Adam, but all the good in our actions and in our thoughts must be attributed to him alone. 5:39. According to this principle it is boastful and impious to consider oneself the author of any work. It means to compare oneself with God who alone deposited in our soul the germ of good, and who alone is qualified to impregnate it. 5:40. This quality, without which we would be swallowed up by evil and blended with nothingness or matter, is called by Philo by its true name. It is the grace. Grace, he says, is the heavenly Virgin who serves as mediatress between God and the soul, between God who holds forth, and the soul which receives. The entire written law is but a symbol of grace. 5:41. Along with this quite mysterious influence, Philo admits another influence which endangers no less the moral responsibility, and consequently, the free choice. It is the reversibility of good. The righteous is the expiatory victim of the wicked, and it is for the sake of the righteous that God lavishes upon the wicked his inexhaustible treasures. 5:42. This dogma, equally adopted by the Kabbalists and applied by them to the entire universe, is fundamentally a development of grace. Grace alone brings about the merit of the righteous. Why, then, can it not also come by the same channel to the wicked? As to that other obstacle to human liberty, the original sin, it would not be impossible to find its definition in some isolated words of our author. 5:43. But in such an important subject we must expect more explicit and more definite proofs. We can positively state that Philo considered life itself as a state of forfeiture and of compulsion. Consequently, the more man enters life, or the further he penetrates through will or through intelligence the realm of nature, the more he must have believed that man wanders from God, that he becomes perverted and degraded. This principle is almost the only foundation of Philo's morality, which we shall survey rapidly. While we meet here with some contradictions now and then, yet the Greek influence extends to the language only. The background is entirely Oriental and mystic. For example, when Philo tells us, as Antisthenes and Zeno do, that we must live according to nature, he understands by human nature not only the entire domination of spirit over body, of reason over senses, but also the observation of all the revealed laws, undoubtedly, as interpreted and understood by him. 544 When he admits, like Plato and the Stoic school, what was later called the four cardinal virtues, he represents them, at the same time, as inferior and purely human virtues. Above these he shows us, as their common source, the goodness or love, a purely religious virtue which concerns itself with God alone, whose image and purest emanation it is. It springs directly from the Eden, that is to say, from divine wisdom, where alone joy, pleasure, and delight in God is found. 545 It is probably in this sense, and following the example of Socrates, that he identifies virtue with wisdom. 546 We must, finally, take care not to attribute to him Aristotle's thoughts when, following the expressions of that philosopher, he says that virtue may come from three sources: from knowledge, nature, and exercise. 547 True science and wisdom, according to Philo, is not the one which results from a natural development of our intelligence, but the one given to us by the grace of God. According to the Greek philosopher, it is nature itself that drives us towards the good. According to Philo, there are in man two entirely contrary natures which combat each other, and one of which must necessarily succumb. Thenceforth both are in a state of violence and restraint which does not permit them to remain at rest. Whence his third expedient to attain moral perfection, asceticism in its highest degree as a substitute for the legitimate control of the will and reason over our desires. In fact, it is not only the question here of lessening evil and of confining it to more or less restricted limits, but it must be pursued as long as the least trace of it is visible. It must be destroyed, if possible, root and branch. For the evil we suffer from in this world is entirely in our passions, which Philo considers absolutely foreign to the nature of the soul. 548 The passions, to use his language, have their origin in the flesh. The flesh, therefore, must be humiliated and mortified. It must be combated under all forms and in all instances. 549 We must lift ourselves from this state of forfeiture which is called life. We must regain liberty in the very bosom of that prison which we call body by absolute indifference to all perishable possessions. 550 As this state of misery is the purpose and result of marriage, the latter is considered by Philo, without being openly condemned, as a humiliating necessity from which the select souls, at least, ought to liberate themselves. 551 These, approximately, are the principal characteristics of the ascetic life, more so conceived and shown to us by Philo, than he has seen it realized by the sect of the therapeutics. But the ascetic life is only a means, its aim, that is to say, the aim of morality itself, the highest degree of perfection, of happiness and of existence, is the union of the soul with God through total forgetfulness of itself, through enthusiasm and through love. Here are some passages which we may believe to have been borrowed from some mystic of modern times. Oh, my soul! If you desire to inherit heavenly gifts, it is not only necessary, as our first patriarch did, to leave the land you inhabit, that is to say, your body, the family you were born in, that is to say, the senses, and the house of your father, or the word. You must also avoid yourself that you may be outside of you, like those Corybantes who are intoxicated with divine enthusiasm. For the inheritance of heavenly blessing is only there where the soul, full of enthusiasm, does not live any more in itself, but plunges with delight into divine love and, attracted, ascends towards its Father. Quis rerum divinarum has sit. Once delivered from all passion, the soul pours itself out like a pure libation before the Lord. For to pour one's soul before God, to break the chains we find in the vain cares of this perishable life, means to step out of oneself to reach the limits of the universe, and to enjoy the heavenly sight of Him who always was. De ebrietate. The contemplative life, although it may not be the only one for man to choose, is placed by such principles far above all social virtues, whose principle is love and whose aim is the well-being of man. 552 Even the cult I mean the outward cult cannot bring us to the aim we are to look for. Philo is really very embarrassed on this point. Just as we must, he says, take care of the body, since it is the dwelling place of the soul, just so must we observe the written laws, for the truer we will be to them, the better will we understand things they symbolize. In addition to this, we must avoid the blame and the accusations of the masses. 553. This last reason resembles very much the postscript of some letters. This alone expresses the thought of our philosopher and establishes a closer relation between him and the Kabbalists. It also justifies the opinion the Talmudists had of their brethren who were initiated in Greek learning. Of what has been said until now, we obtain two extremely important deductions with reference to the origin of the Kabbalah. The first deduction is that this traditional doctrine was not taken from the writings of Philo. Indeed, since all Greek systems, and we may even say the entire Greek civilization, have left so many traces, intimately blended with elements of another nature, in the writings of Philo, why do we not find the same condition in the oldest writings of the Kabbalistic science? We say it again, that we can never find, either in the Zohar or in the Book of Formation, the least trace of that splendid civilization which has been transplanted by the Ptolemies to Egyptian soil. Without mentioning the previously indicated external difficulties which we uphold here in their full force, is it possible that Simeon ben Yohai and his friends, or whoever the authors of the Zohar may have been, could differentiate in Philo's writings, if these were their only guide, between that which has been borrowed from the different Greek philosophers, whose names are seldom mentioned by their Alexandrian disciples, and that which belongs to another doctrine which is based upon the idea of one and immanent principle which is the substance and form of all beings? Such a supposition is unworthy of discussion. Besides, what we designated as the Oriental part of Philo's syncretism is far from corresponding in all important points with the mysticism taught by the Palestinian sages. Thus, according to Philo, there are only 5 divine forces or attributes, while the Kabbalists admit 10 Sephiroth. Although enthusiastically expounding the doctrine, Philo nevertheless preserves always a certain dualism, the absolute being and the forces, or the substance and the attributes which, according to him, are separated by an impassable abyss. The Kabbalists look upon the Sephiroth as diverse boundaries within which the absolute principle of things circumscribes itself, or as vessels, to use their own mode of expression. The divine substance, they add, need only withdraw, and these vessels would break and waste. Let us also remember that they expressly taught the identity of existence with thought. Philo, who is unconsciously dominated by the idea of Plato and Anaxagoras, that matter is a principle distinct from God and everlasting, as he is naturally led to consider life a forfeiture and the body a prison. This also accounts for his contempt of marriage, which he regards merely as a gratification of the flesh. The Kabbalists, on the other hand, although agreeing with the scriptures that in the first days of the creation, when he was not ruled by sensual passions, man was happier than now, still look upon life in general as a necessary trial, as a means through which finite beings like we may elevate themselves to God, and unite with him in boundless love. Marriage to them is not only the symbol, but the beginning, the first condition of this mysterious union. They carry marriage into the soul and into heaven. It is the fusion of 2 human souls by mutual completion. The interpretative system, finally, which Philo applies to the Holy Scriptures, although basically identical with that of the Kabbalists, could not, however, have served as a pattern to the latter. Philo was surely not entirely ignorant of the language of his fathers, but we can easily prove that he had only the Septuagint version before him, the version that was used also by all the Alexandrian Jews. His mystic interpretations are based mainly upon the expressions of this translation and upon a purely Greek etymology. 554 Now, then, what is to become of those ingenious procedures used in the Zohar, whose force is entirely destroyed if not applied to the sacred language? 555 Nevertheless, we admit that this difference in form would not be of such very great importance to us, if Philo and the Kabbalists were always to agree upon the choice of the texts, the scriptural passages upon which they based their philosophical system, or, indeed, if disregarding the language, the same symbols would call forth the same ideas. But this is never so. Thus we do not find, either in the Zohar or in the Book of Formation, the least trace of those rich and ingenious allegories which we consider the sole property of the Alexandrian philosopher. No mention is made in these works of the personification of the senses in woman, of Eve, our first mother, of voluptuousness in the serpent which advised evil, of egotism in Cain, which man brought forth by uniting with Eve, that is to say, with the senses, after listening to the advice of the serpent, of the mental type in Abel, which entirely despises the body and succumbs through ignorance of mundane things, of the divine science in Abraham, of mundane science in Hagar, of virtue in Sarah, of the primitive nature of regenerated man in Isaac, of ascetic virtue in Jacob, and of faith in Tamar. All these reasons, we believe, justify our saying that Philo's writings exerted no influence whatever upon the Kabbalah. We come now to the second deduction which may be drawn from these writings, and from the character of their writer. We have seen how indiscriminately and with what disregard for sound logic Philo pillaged, so to speak, the entire Greek philosophy. What reason have we, then, to credit him with better inventiveness, more sagacity, and greater depth in that part of his opinions which reminds us, at least, of the dominant principles of the Kabbalistic system? Are we not justified in thinking that he found also this part already made in certain preserved traditions of his co-religionists, and that he only trimmed it with the brilliant colors of his imagination? In this case these traditions were quite old, for Egypt must have received them from the Holy Land before the memory of Jerusalem and of the language of their fathers was entirely extinguished among the Alexandrian Jews. But, fortunately, we need not rely upon conjectures. There are facts which prove conclusively that some of the ideas we now speak of were known more than a century before the Christian era. We are assured by Philo himself, as we have said before, that he had drawn from an oral tradition which was preserved by the elders of his people, 556, attributing to the sect of the Therapeutists the mystic books of a very remote antiquity, De Vita Contemplativa, and the use of allegorical interpretations applied without exception and without reserve to all parts of the Holy Scriptures. The entire law, he says, is to them like a living being in which the body is represented by the letter and the soul by a very deep meaning. Through the words, as through a mirror, the rational soul perceives in the latter the most hidden and the most extraordinary wonders. 557. Let us keep in mind that the same comparison is used in the Zohar, with the difference that beneath the body is put the cloak of the law by which the material deeds of the Bible are designated, and that above the soul is placed a more saintly soul, that is to say, the divine word, source of all inspiration and of all truth. But we have still older and more reliable witnesses than Philo. We shall begin with the most important of all, the famous version of the Septuagint. The Talmud already had a vague knowledge 558 of the numerous inaccuracies met within this famous translation, yet it venerated it very highly. Modern criticism has conclusively proven that the translation was made in behalf of a system extremely hostile 559 to biblical anthropomorphism, and there we will find the germ of Philo's mysticism. 560 Thus, when the sacred text expressly states 561 that Moses, his brother, and the 70 elders saw the God of Israel sitting upon a throne of sapphire, the Greek translation says that it is not God they have seen, but the place he dwells in. 562 When another prophet, Isaiah, sees God sitting upon his throne and the folds of his robe filling the temple, Isaiah 6:I, the Septuagint replaces this too material picture by the glory of God, the Shekinah of the Hebrews. 563 Jehovah really does not speak to Moses face to face, but in a vision, and it is probable that in the mind of the translator this vision was only an intellectual one. 564 Until here we see only the destruction of anthropomorphism and the desire to disengage the idea of God from the, sometimes, sublime images which put him beyond our intelligence. But here are matters more worthy of our interest. Instead of Lord Zebaoth, the God of hosts, whom the Bible represents as another Mars exciting the fury of war and himself marching into battle, 565 we find in the Greek translation not the supreme God, but the forces of which Philo speaks so much in his writings, and the Lord, the God of the forces. When comparison is made to the dew born from the bosom of Aurora, 566 the anonymous translator substitutes for it that mysterious being which God brought forth from his bosom before the morning star, 567 that is to say, the Logos, the divine light which preceded the world and the stars. When speaking of Adam and Eve, the Septuagint is careful to adhere strictly to the text that God created them male and female. 568 But this twofold character, these two halves of humanity, are united in one and the same being, which is evidently the prototype man, the Adam Catman. 569 In this curious monument we can also find unquestionable traces of the theory of numbers and of ideas. For example, God is not the creator of heaven and earth in the ordinary sense of the word, he simply made them visible from the invisible state in which they were previously. 570 Who created all these, asks the Hebrew prophet, who made them visible, 571 says the Alexandrian interpreter. When the same prophet represents the master of the universe commanding the stars like a numerous army, 572 our interpreter makes him say that God produced the world according to numbers. 573 While an allusion to the doctrines of Plato and Pythagoras is easily found in these diverse passages, we must not forget that the theory of numbers is also taught, although grossly, in the Sefer Yetzirah, and that the theory of ideas is absolutely inseparable from the metaphysics of the Zohar. We want to add here that an application of the Pythagorean principle is found in the first of these two monuments, which is literally reproduced in the writings of Philo, and for which we shall look in vain in the works of any other Greek writing philosopher. It is because of the influence of the number 7 that we possess 7 principal organs, the 5 senses, the organ of speech and the generative organs, and it is for the same reason that there are 7 gates of the soul, to wit, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and 1 mouth. 574 We find also in the Septuagint another Kabbalistic tradition which was later appropriated to Gnosticism. When the text tells us that the Most High marked the borders of the nations according to the number of children of Israel, we read in the Alexandrian translation that the nations were divided according to the number of the angels of the Lord. 575 This, apparently odd and arbitrary interpretation, 576 becomes very intelligible when compared with a passage in the Zohar where we are told that there are 70 nations on earth. 577 That each of these nations is placed under the power of an angel whom it recognizes as its God, and who, so to speak, is the personification of its own spirit. The children of Israel alone are privileged to have over them no one but the true God who had chosen them as his people. 578 We find the same tradition with another sacred writer who is just as old as the Septuagint version. 579 No doubt that the Greek philosophy which flourished in the capital of the Ptolemies exercised a great influence upon this famous translation, but we find ideas there which have evidently been drawn from another source, and which could not even have been brought forth upon Egyptian soil. For were it otherwise, that is, if all the elements pointed out by us, as the allegoric interpretations of the religious elements, the personification of the word and its identity with the absolute place, were the result of the general trend of thought of that period, in the land of which we spoke, how is it that during a lapse of 2 centuries, from the time of the last authors of the Septuagint version until Philo, not the least mention of that trend is made in the history of Greek philosophy? 580 But we have another, nearly contemporaneous monument, wherein we find the same spirit in a more definite form, and the Hebrew origin of which cannot be contested. It is the book of Jesus, son of Sirach, commonly called Ecclesiasticus. This religious author is known to us at present only through a Greek translation which came from the pen of his grandson. In a sort of preface we are told by the latter that he came to Egypt, probably after leaving Judea, in the 38th year of the reign of Pt.2. If we take therefore the original writer to have lived 50 years earlier, we find him 2 centuries before the Christian era. Without placing implicit faith in the testimony of the translator, who assures us that his grandfather drew only from Hebrew sources, we want to point out that Jesus, the son of Sirach, is often eulogized by the Talmud under the name of Joshua ben Sirach ben Eliezer. 581 The original text still existed at the time of St. Jerome, and until the beginning of the 4th century Jews as well as Gentiles counted it among their sacred writings. Now then, we find in the writings of this ancient author not only the traditions of which we just spoke, but also the doctrine of the Logos or of divine wisdom nearly in the same form as it is taught by Philo and by the Kabbalists. Wisdom is, first of all, the same power as the word, or the memra of the Chaldean translators. It is the word, it went forth from the mouth of the Most High. 582 It cannot be taken as a simple abstraction, as a purely logical being, for it manifests itself in the midst of its people, in the assembly of the Most High, and praises its soul. Chapter Ksiv. 1. This heavenly assembly is probably composed of forces subordinate to it, for the Talmud and Zohar make frequent use of a very similar expression to convey the same thought. 583 Wisdom, thus introduced upon the scene, presents itself as the firstborn of God, for it existed already at the very beginning, when time was not yet, and it will not cease to exist in the course of ages. 584 Wisdom has always been with God. Chapter 1. It is through wisdom that the world was created. Wisdom alone formed the celestial spheres and descended to the depths of the abyss. Its empire extends over the waves of the ocean, over all regions of the earth, and over all the peoples and all the nations that inhabit it. Chapter Ksiv. 566. Having been ordered by God to look for a dwelling place here below, its choice fell upon Zion. 585 When we consider that, according to our author, every other nation is subject to the influence of an angel or a subordinate power, we ought to look upon the choice of Zion as the dwelling place for wisdom as a simple metaphor. On the contrary, that choice shows, as the quoted tradition expressly says, that the Spirit of God, or the Logos, acted directly without an intermediary, upon the prophets of Israel. 586 If wisdom were not something substantial, if it were not in some way the instrument and the servant of God, how could it be conceived sitting upon a throne within a column of clouds, the same column, probably, that marched before the Hebrew people in the desert? 587 The spirit of this book, as well as that of the Septuagint version and the Chaldaic paraphrases of Onkelos, consists, on the whole, in placing between the sovereign being and this perishable world a mediating power, which is, at the same time, eternal and the first work of God, which acts and speaks for him, and which is itself his word and his creative power. 588 The abyss between the finite and the infinite is thus filled, heaven and earth are not divorced any longer, God manifests himself through his word, and his word through the universe. But the divine word has no need of being recognized first in the visible things, it sometimes comes directly to man in the form of a holy inspiration, or through the gift of prophecy and revelation. It was thus that the nation was raised above all other nations, and a man, the lawgiver of the Hebrews, above all other men. I want to add here that there is no conflict in this, so important, result between theology and criticism. For when we inquire into the most orthodox translations, as that of Saki, about the work that interests us at present, we shall find many allusions to the doctrine of the Word. 589 We may say the same of the Book of Wisdom, where the following passage has long since been found. 590 Wisdom is more active than the most active thing. It is the breath, that is to say, an emanation of God's power and a very pure effusion of the brightness of the Almighty. It is the reflection of the everlasting light, the spotless mirror of the majesty of God and the image of his goodness. Although only one, it can accomplish everything, and resting immutably in itself, it renews all things. It enters at different times into holy souls and makes them prophets and friends of God. Chapter 7, 24-27. But it seems to us that the general character of this work comes nearer to the Platonic philosophy than to the mysticism of Philo. And as neither the age nor the true origin of this work is known, 591 we are compelled to wait until a critic, more learned than ours, will have settled these questions. 592 However, the facts we have collected demonstrate fully that the Kabbalah is neither a child of the Greek civilization of Alexandria, nor of pure Platonism. In fact, were we to treat only of the principle which serves as basis to every Kabbalistic system, namely, the personification of the Word and of the divine wisdom considered as the immanent cause of the beings, we can find it at an epoch when the particular Alexandrian spirit was still in the process of being born. And where do we find it? In a traditional translation, so to speak, of the scriptures, and in another monument of a purely Hebrew origin. When details and secondary ideas are considered, as for example the different applications of the allegorical method, or the deductions that may be drawn from the metaphysical principle of which we have spoken, the great difference between the writings of Philo and those of the Hebrew Kabbalists are easily seen. Chapter 4. Relation of the Kabbalah to Christianity. Since the Kabbalah is indebted neither to philosophy nor to Greece, nor to the capital of the Ptolemies, it necessarily must have its cradle in Asia. Judaism must have brought it forth through its own efforts, or it must have sprung from some other religion born in the Orient, and so near to Judaism as to exert an unquestionable influence upon it. Is it possible that Christianity is that religion? Notwithstanding the extreme interest aroused at first by this question, the solution of which is to be found in what has been previously said, we cannot pause to consider it for any length of time. It is evident to us that all the great metaphysical and religious principles underlying the Kabbalah antedate the Christian dogmas. It is not, however, within the scope of our work to compare these. But no matter what meaning we may ascribe to these principles, their form alone explains to us a fact which, we believe, is of very great social and religious interest. A great many Kabbalists converted themselves to Christianity. We mention among others, Paul Rickey, Konrad Otten, 593 Rittengel, editor of the Sefer Yetzirah. In more recent times, towards the end of the 18th century, we see another Kabbalist, the Polish Jew Jacob Frank, pass into the bosom of Catholicism with several thousand of his adherents, after founding the sect of the Zoharites. 594 The rabbis have long since noticed this danger, and many among them have openly shown their hostility to the study of the Kabbalah. 595 While others protect it even today as the Holy Ark, as the entrance to the Holy of Holies, to keep the profane from it. Leon de Modena, who wrote a book against the authenticity of the Zohar 596, doubts very much the salvation of those who gave to the press the principal Kabbalistic works. 597 Christians, like Knorr of Rosenroth, Reuchlin, and Rittengel after his conversion, on the other hand, saw therein the most potent means of lowering the barrier that separates synagogue and church. In the hope of bringing about someday this fervently desired result, they collected in their works all the passages of the Zohar and of the New Testament which present some similarity to one another. We are far from any religious polemics, and instead of following these footsteps and thus becoming their echo, we shall rather investigate whether there is anything in common between the Kabbalah and the most ancient organs of Gnosticism. We shall thus be able to ascertain whether the principles, whose influence and origin we endeavor to know, were not spread outside of Judea, whether they did not exert their influence also upon other people who were entire strangers to the Greek civilization, and whether, accordingly, we are not justified in regarding the Kabbalah as a precious remnant of a religious philosophy of the Orient which, transplanted to Alexandria, mingled with the doctrines of Plato, and under the usurped name of Dionysius the Areopagite 598 was able to penetrate even into the mysticism of the Middle Ages. Without departing from Palestine, we first meet at Samaria, in the days of the Apostles, and probably in an advanced age, a very singular person, Simon the magician, Magus. Who was this man who enjoyed such incontestable power, Acts 8:10, and such boundless admiration among his fellow citizens? 599 He may have had a base view of the motive which prompts us to divide the highest gifts with others, but he surely was not an impostor, for he looked up to the apostles and endeavored to obtain from them for money the power to impart the Holy Spirit. Acts 8:18, 19. I go still further and maintain that his authority would have been in vain were it not supported by a well-known and long-accredited idea in the minds of the people. We find this idea very clearly expressed in the supernatural role attributed to Simon. The entire people, say the Acts, from the highest to the lowest, considered him the personification of the great power of God. Hic est virtus Dei qui vocata magna, this man is the great power of God. Ibid. 10. Now St. Jerome tells us that our Samaritan prophet understood by it nothing else but the word of God, Sermo Dei. 600 In this quality he must have necessarily united in him all the other attributes, for according to the religious metaphysics of the Hebrews the word or wisdom includes implicitly the lower Sephiroth. St. Jerome also gives us as authentic the following words which Simon 601 applied to himself: I am the divine word, I possess the real beauty, I am the comforter, I am the Almighty, I am all that is in God. 602 Every one of these expressions corresponds to one of the Sephiroth of the Kabbalah, the influence of which we find again in the following fact reported by another church father. 603 Simon, the magician, who considered himself the visible manifestation of the Word, wanted to personify also its correlating female principle, its spouse the divine thought in a woman of bad repute. This strange conception, which finds no support either in the Platonic philosophy or in the Alexandrian school if the latter existed already at that time, agrees wonderfully, although at the same time disfiguring it, with the Kabbalistic system where wisdom, that is the word, represented as the male principle, has, like all other principles of the same order, its half, its spouse, which in this case is the Sephiroth that bears the name of intelligence, Bina. 604 and which has been taken by several Gnostics for the Holy Spirit, being always represented by them in the form of a woman. Among these Gnostics is the Jew Elxai, who has many traits resembling the prophet of Samaria. His name, even which he surely chose himself, suggests the role he had taken upon himself. 605 This heresiarch not only conceives the Holy Spirit as a female principle, as just remarked, but he looks upon Christ as a divine power only, which clothes itself at times in a material form and whose colossal proportions he describes in minute details. 606 We remember having found in the Zohar a similar description of the white head, and that another work, very famous among the Kabbalists, the pseudonymous Alphabet of Rabbi Akiba, 607 speaks of God in nearly the same terms. Along with this manner of conceiving the Word, the Holy Spirit, and in general the divine pairs of which the Pleroma 608 is composed, we find also in the monuments left by the Syrian Bardesanes the principle of the Kabbalistic cosmogony. The unknown Father who lives in the center of the light has a Son, this is Christ, or the heavenly man. Christ again, by uniting with his companion, his spouse, which is the Holy Ghost, produces successively the four elements, air and water, fire and earth. These elements and the external world in general are thus here, as in the Sefer Yetzirah, a simple emanation or the voice of the Spirit. Ephraim, hymn 55, page 755. But we need not persist in painfully gathering some scattered memories in the Acts of the Apostles or in the hymns of Saint Ephraim. There is a monument of great value from which we may draw quite liberally. We refer to the Codex Nazarius, 609, that Bible of purely Oriental Gnosticism. We know that Saint Jerome and Saint Epiphanius date back the sect of the Nazarenes to the time of the birth of Christ. 610. Now then, the similarity of a great many of their dogmas with the most essential elements of the Kabbalistic system is so great, that when reading them in the work just mentioned, we believe we have found some stray fragments of the Zohar. Thus, God is always called the King and the Master of the Light. He is himself the purest splendor and the infinite and eternal light. He is also beauty, life, justice, and mercy. 611. All forms that we perceive in this world emanate from him. He is the creator and the architect, but no one knows his own wisdom and his own essence. 612. All creatures ask one another for his name, and they are compelled to answer that he has no name. As the King of the Light, the infinite light, he has no name that can be invoked, nor is he of a nature that can be known. We can reach him only through a pure heart, an upright spirit and a faith full of love. 613. The steps by which the Nazarene doctrine descends from the highest being to the furthest limits of the creation are the same used in a passage of the Zohar which has been quoted several times in this work. All genii, kings and creatures praise vyingly, with prayers and hymns, the Supreme King of Light who emanates 5 rays of marvelous brilliancy. The first is the light that illumines all the beings, the second is the mild breath that animates them, the third is the melodious voice that expresses their cheerfulness, the fourth is the word which instructs them and elevates them to bear witness to their faith, the fifth is the type of all forms under which they develop, like fruit which nourishes by the action of the sun. 614. We cannot fail to recognize in these lines to the translation of which we can find ourselves the different degrees of existence which the Kabbalists represent by the thought, breath or spirit, voice and word. Here are other pictures, just as familiar, which express the same idea. Before any creature existed at all, life was hidden within itself, eternal and incomprehensible, without light and without form, Furhi. From its bosom developed the luminous atmosphere of Erzivo, which is also called the Word, the Garment, Elvusha, Emmalelo, or the symbolical river that represents wisdom. From this river flow the living waters, or the great waters which, to the Nazarenes as well as to the Kabbalists, typify the third manifestation of God, the intelligence or the Spirit. This again produces a second life which, however, is far removed from the first one. 615. This second life is called Yushamin, Yeshmun, or Minute, the place of the forms, of the ideas. In its bosom the idea of the creation was first conceived, and it is the loftiest and purest type of the creation. The second life gave birth to a third which is called the Excellent Father, Abita, Av Yatha, 616. The Unknown Old One, and the Ancient of the World, Sanam Sway Abtijan Tamet Grandivum Mundi. Ib. Volume 2, page 88. When the Excellent Father looked into the abyss, the darkness of the black waters, he left his image there, which under the name of Fetahil, became the demiurge or the architect of the universe. 617. From then on begins an interminable series of eons, an infernal and a celestial hierarchy which does not interest us any more. It is enough for us to know that these 3 lives, these 3 degrees in the Pleroma hold the same rank as the 3 Kabbalistic faces, whose very names, Pasufo, are often met with in the mouth of these sectarians. 618. And we may place so much the more confidence in this interpretation, as we find also among them the 10 Sephiroth divided, as in the Zohar, in 3 superior and 7 inferior attributes. 619. What concerns the singular accident which brought forth the demiurge, and as to the more and more imperfect generation of the subordinated genii, these are mythologic expressions of the principle that darkness and evil are but the gradual weakening of the divine light, Caligo ubi extiterat isham extitis decrementum et detrimentum, which is also very clearly formulated in the Nazarene Code. Ib. Volume 1, page 145. Hence the name, body, or matter, li or guf, is given to the Prince of Darkness. Ib. 3, Onomasticon. This name does not differ from the one carried by the same principle in the Kabbalistic system, Klippeth, shells, matter. The Nazarenes also recognized two Adams, one a celestial, and the other earthly, the father of humanity. Because of his body, the latter is the work of the subordinated genii, the stellar spirits, but the soul is the emanation of the divine life. 620 This soul, which was to return to its father in the heavenly regions, was detained in this world because it was seduced by evil powers. The message, then, entrusted by the Kabbalists to the angel Raziel is given for execution by our heretics to Gabriel, who plays quite an important role in their belief. It was the angel Gabriel who brought to our first parents, in order to raise them from their fall and to open to them the way to the bosom of their Father, the true law, the word of life mysteriously spread by tradition until the advent of John the Baptist, the true prophet according to the Nazarenes, who promulgated it aloud on the shores of the Jordan. Volume 2, p. 25-26-117. We could cite other traditions which could be taken to have been borrowed from the Midrashim and the Zohar, 621, but we are content with having pointed out that which has the best claim for the attention of the philosopher. Were we now to meet with the same principles in Egyptian Gnosticism, in the doctrine of Basilides and Valentin, it would be unjust to attribute them to the Greek philosophy, or even to Alexandrian Neoplatonism. And, in fact, it would be very easy for us to demonstrate in what we have still left from the two celebrated heresiarchs just mentioned the most characteristic elements of the Kabbalah, as the unity of substance, 622 the formation of things, first by concentration, then by gradual expansion of the divine light, 623 the theory of pairs and of the four worlds, 624 the two Adams, the three souls, 625 and even the symbolic language of the numbers and the letters of the alphabet. 626 But we have nothing to gain from demonstrating this similarity, for we believe we have reached the aim we have set for ourselves in the last part of our work. After having previously established that the metaphysical ideas which make up the foundation of the Kabbalah were not borrowed from Greek philosophy, that, instead of being born either in a pagan school or in the Jewish school of Alexandria, they were brought thither from Palestine, we have finally proven that its cradle is not as yet to be found in Palestine, or at least, in the so-called Judea. For in spite of impenetrable mystery with which the teachers of the synagogue surround them, we find them in a less abstract and not so pure form, it is true, in the infidel capital of the Sumerians and with the heretics of Syria. It matters little that here they were taught to the people as the foundation of the religion, and assumed thereby the character of mythological personification, 627 while there, having become the property of the elite intelligences, they made up rather an extensive and profound metaphysical system. The basis of these ideas remains the same, their interrelation, whether in the formulas with which they are clothed, or in the more or less fantastical traditions that accompany them, remain unchanged. We still have to investigate, therefore, from what part and from what religion of the Orient they may have come to penetrate directly into Judaism, and from there into the different systems we have mentioned. It is this last step we still have to make in order to fully accomplish our task. Chapter 5. Relation of the Kabbalah to the religion of the Chaldeans and Persians. Were we to find within the present circumscribed limits of our investigation a people, distinguished by its civilization as well as by its political power, which exercised an immediate and lasting influence upon the Hebrews, we could evidently find within the bosom of such a people the solution of the problem we have raised. We find these conditions complied with, even beyond the unreasonable demands of the critic, in the Chaldeans and Persians who were united into one nation by the arms of Cyrus and by the religion of Zoroaster. And, indeed, can we think of a more appropriate event in the life of a people that could change its moral constitution and modify its ideas and customs as the memorable exile that has been called the Babylonian captivity? Is it possible that the 70 years' sojourn of the Israelites, priests and laymen, teachers and common people, in the land of their conquerors, exerted no influence on either side? We have already cited a Talmudical passage wherein the elders of the synagogue openly acknowledge that their ancestors brought with them from the land of their exile the names of the angels, the names of the months and even the letters of the alphabet. It is impossible to suppose that the names of the months were not accompanied by certain astronomical knowledge, 628 probably of such a nature as we have met in the Sefer Yetzirah, and that the names of the angels were separated from the entire celestial and infernal hierarchy adopted by the Magi. It has also long since been noted that Satan appears for the first time in the sacred writings in the story of the Chaldean Job. 629 This rich and learned mythology, which has been adopted by the Talmud and spread in the Mishnah, constitutes also the poetical part and, if I may use the expression, the outer cover of the Zohar. But we do not wish to insist upon this long-known fact. Disregarding the Chaldeans, who left no visible or reliable trace, and who, besides, were morally and materially conquered by the Persians before the return of the Jews to the Holy Land, we shall prove the presence, if not of the most general principles, but of nearly all the elements of the Kabbalah in the Zend-Avesta and the religious commentaries depending upon it. We wish to remark, incidentally, that this vast and admirable monument which has been known to us for more than a century, at this epoch, when we so eagerly follow up all sources, did not yet render all the service to historic philosophy, the true science of the human mind which the latter justly expects of it. We do not pretend to fill the gap, but we hope to show the transmission of ideas between Persia and Judea, as we have already done in part, with reference to Judea and Alexandria. We must first point out that all chronologists, whether Jewish or Christian, 630 agree that the first deliverance of the Israelites who remained captives in Chaldea since Nebuchadnezzar, Ezra, I.1, took place during the first years of the reign of Cyrus over Babylon, 536 to 530 before the Christian era. The divergence of opinion confines itself to this very limited period. If we are to believe the calculations of Anquetil-Duperron, 631, Zoroaster had already commenced his religious mission in 549, that is at least 14 years before the first return of the captive Hebrews to their fatherland. Zoroaster was then 40 years old, the most brilliant epoch of his life had begun, and continued until 539. During these 10 years Zoroaster converted to his law the entire court and kingdom of King Gustasp, believed to have been Hystaspes, father of Darius. During these 10 years the reputation of the new prophet dismayed even the Brahmins of India, and when one of these came to the court of Gustasp for the purpose of overpowering the one he called impostor, he and all that were with him were compelled to yield to the irresistible power of their adversary. From 539 to 524, finally, Zoroaster openly taught his religion in the capital of the Babylonian Empire, which he converted entirely by connecting wisely his own teachings with the already existing traditions. 632 Is it reasonable to suppose that the Israelites, who witnessed such a revolution, and returned to their fatherland at a time when that revolution spread its most vivid brilliancy and, consequently, must have left the strongest impression upon their minds? Is it possible, I say, that they took with them no trace of it, not even in their most secret opinions and ideas? Must not the great question of the origin of evil, which until then remained untouched by Judaism, and which is, so to speak, the center and starting point of the religion of the Persians, must it not have acted powerfully upon the imagination of these people of the Orient, who were accustomed to explain everything by divine intervention and to ascend in similar problems to the source of things? It cannot be argued that because they were crushed under the weight of their misfortune they remained strangers to all that happened around them in the land of their exile. The scriptures themselves point to them with some satisfaction as being instructed in all the sciences and, consequently, in all the ideas of their conquerors, and admitted with the latter to the highest dignities of the empire. This is just the character of Daniel, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah, 633, the two latter playing such an active part in the deliverance of their brethren. But this is not all. Besides 40,000 people who returned to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, a second emigration, headed by Ezra, took place under the reign of Artaxerxes Longimanus, about 70 years after the first emigration. During this interval the religious reform of Zoroaster had time to spread to all parts of the Babylonian Empire, and to take deep root in the minds of the people. From the return to their land until the conquest by Alexander the Great the Jews always remained the subjects of the Persian kings. And even after this event, until their total dispersion, they seemed to have looked upon the Euphrates, the banks of which they once bathed with their tears, as their second fatherland when their eyes and minds turned to Jerusalem. The Babylonian synagogue arose under the civil and religious influence of the heads of captivity, Reish Lutho, and it cooperated with the one in Palestine for the definite organization of rabbinic Judaism. 634 Wherever they found an asylum, at Surah, at Pompedita, and at Nehadia, they founded religious schools which flourished no less than those of the metropolis. Among the teachers who sprang from their midst we mention Hillel the Babylonian, who died about 40 years before the advent of Christ, and who was the teacher of that Yohanan ben Zakkai who played such a great role in the Kabbalistic stories previously quoted. These same schools produced also the Babylonian Talmud, the final and most complete expression of Judaism. From the enumeration of these facts alone we may conclude that no nation exerted upon the Jews such deep influence as the Persians, that no moral power could have penetrated so deeply into their spirit as the religious system of Zoroaster with its long train of traditions and commentaries. But all doubt vanishes when we pass from the purely external relations to a comparison of the ideas which represent in the two nations the most exalted results and the very foundations of their respective civilizations. However, to avoid the suspicion that we have founded beforehand the origin of the Kabbalah upon isolated and purely incidental resemblances, we shall point out in a few words and by some examples the influence of the Persian religion upon Judaism in general, before demonstrating all the elements of the Kabbalistic system in the Zend-Avesta. Far from being a digression, this part of our research will contribute no little to the strengthening of our opinion, and I hasten to add that I do not at all intend to speak of the fundamental dogmas of the Old Testament. For, since Zoroaster himself continually refers to traditions much older than he, it is not necessary, yes, it is even not permissible from the standpoint of impartial criticism, to regard the following as having been borrowed from his doctrine, the 6 days of the creation, so easily recognized in the 6 Gehanbas, 635 the earthly paradise and the ruse of the demon who, in the shape of a serpent, kindled the revolt in the soul of our first parents, 636 the terrible punishment and the increasing forfeiture of the latter who, after having lived like angels, were obliged to cover themselves with the skins of animals, to wrest the metals from the bowels of the earth and to invent all the arts by which we subsist, 637 finally, the last judgment with its accompanying terrors, with the resurrection in spirit and flesh. 638 all these beliefs are found, it is true, in just as explicit a form in the Bundehesh 639 and in the Zend-Avesta as in Genesis 640, but we repeat again that we are fully convinced that the source is to be looked for at a much earlier age. We cannot say the same of Rabbinical Judaism, which is much more modern than the religion of Zoroaster. The traces of Parsiism are here, as we shall soon ascertain, very visible, and we shall soon see what light can be thrown upon the origin of the Kabbalah when we keep in mind that the oldest teachers of this mysterious science are also counted among the doctors of the Mishnah and among the most venerated elders of the synagogue. When side by side with the wisest maxims on the application of life, when alongside the most consoling thoughts on mercy and divine justice, we find also in Judaism traces of the darkest superstition, we must look for the cause of these, especially in the terror instilled by its demonology. The power the latter ascribes to the evil spirits, Shadim, Ruheth, is so great that at every moment of his life man may think himself surrounded by invisible enemies who are set upon the loss of his body as well as of his soul. Man is not yet born, and they await him already at the cradle to contend with him for God and the tenderness of a mother. Hardly may he see the light of this world, when they assail his head with 1,000 perils, and his thoughts with 1,000 impure visions. In short, woe to him if he does not resist forever. For, before life has yet completely left the body, they come to take possession of their prey. Now then, in all ideas of such a nature there is a perfect similarity between the Jewish traditions and the Zend-Avesta. According to this latter monument the demons or the devils, those children of Ahriman and darkness, are just as numerous as the creatures of Ormuzd. There are more than 1,000 species who present themselves under all kinds of forms, and who wander over the earth to spread disease and sickness among man. 641, where, asks Zoroaster of Ormuzd, is the place of the male, where the place of the female Devis, where roam the Devis in mobs from 50, from 100, from 1,000, from 10,000, and, finally, from all sides. 642 destroy the Devis that enfeeble man and those that produce sickness, those that carry off the human heart as the wind sweeps away the clouds. Zend Avenue, Volume 2, page 113. This is the way the Talmud expresses itself on the same subject. Abba Benjamin said, no creature could withstand the evil creatures, Mazakin, had the either faculty of seeing them. Abay adds, they are more numerous than we, and surround us as a ditch surrounds a field. Every one of us, says Rab Hannah 643, has 1,000 of them to the left and 10,000 to the right side. When we feel ourselves pressed in a crowd, it is because of their presence. When our knees give way under our body, they alone are the cause. When we feel as though our extremities had been broken, it is to them again that we must attribute this suffering. 644, the Devis, says the Zend-Avesta, unite with one another and reproduce themselves as man does. Zend Avenue, Volume 2, page 336. But they reproduce themselves also through our own impurities, through the disgraceful acts of self-abuse, and even through the involuntary licentiousness provoked by a voluptuous thought during sleep. According to the Talmud, the demons resemble the angels in 3 things, and in 3 other things they resemble man. Like the angels, they read the future, have wings, and fly in a moment from one end of the world to the other, but they eat, drink, reproduce, and die as man does. 645 Furthermore, they all originated from the lascivious dreams that troubled the nights of our first father during the years passed in solitude. 646 And the same cause even today produces the same effect in his descendants. 647 Certain formulated prayers, therefore, were adopted by Jews and Parsis, whose power is to avert such calamity. 648 The same phantoms, the same terrors, finally, besiege these as well as the others at their last moment. Man scarcely dies, say the Zen books, when he is taken possession of and questioned by the demons. Zen Avenue, Volume 2, page 164. The Darouge, the demon, Nesosh, comes in the form of a fly, places himself upon the head and beats him mercilessly. Zen Avenue, Volume 2, page 316. The soul, separated from the body, arrives then at the bridge Chinavad, which separates our world from the invisible world. There it is judged by 2 angels, one of whom is Mithra, of colossal proportions, with 10,000 eyes, and holding a club in his hand. 649 The rabbis, retaining the same basic idea, picture it still more frightfully. When man, they say, who is about to leave this world, opens his eyes, he notices in his house an extraordinary light, and standing before him he sees the angel of the Lord clothed in light, his body studded with eyes and his hand holding a flaming sword. At the sight of this the dying man is seized with fright which permeates his body and spirit. His soul flees gradually to all the extremities, as one desiring to change his place. But when he comes to know that it is impossible for him to escape, he looks into the face of the one standing before him and delivers himself entirely into his power. If the dying man is a righteous one, the divine presence, Shekinah, appears to him and the soul soon disappears beyond the body. 650 This first test is followed by another, which is called the torture or the ordeal of the grave, Hibat Harkova. 651 As soon as the dead is put in his grave, the soul unites again with him, and opening his eyes, he sees 652 angels who come to judge him. Each holds in his hand 2 fiery rods, others say fiery chains, and the soul and the body are judged at the same time for the evil they have done together. Woe to the man when he is found guilty, for no one will defend him. At the first blow all his limbs are dislocated, at the second, all his bones are broken. But his body is soon reconstructed and the punishment begins anew. 653 We must value these traditions the more, since they have been taken nearly literally from the Zohar, from where they passed into the purely rabbinical writings and into the popular collections. We can add to these beliefs a host of religious customs and practices, equally commanded by the Talmud and the Zend Avesta. Thus the Parsi, when leaving his bed in the morning, must not make 4 steps before having put on the holy girdle which is called the kosti. 654 Under the pretext that during the night he had been contaminated by contact with the demons, and he must not touch any part of his body before having washed his hands and face 3 times. 655 We shall find the same duties, based upon the same reasons, with the followers of the rabbinical law. 656 With the difference that the kosti is replaced by a garment of another shape. The disciples of Zoroaster and the followers of the Talmud consider themselves duty-bound to greet the moon at its first quarter with prayers. 657 And thanksgivings. 658 The practice of keeping from the dead or from the newborn the demons who try to take possession of them, are nearly the same with both. 659 The Parsi as well as the Jew carry their devotion, if I may say so, even to profanation. There are prayers and religious duties for every moment, for every action, for every situation of the physical and moral life. 660 Although we do not lack material for further expansion on this subject, 661 we think it time to finish this parallel. But even the fantastic and eccentric facts which we have collected lend greater certainty to the conclusion which we draw from them. For it is surely not in such beliefs and in such actions that we can invoke the general laws of the human mind. We believe, though, we have demonstrated that the religion, that is to say the civilization of ancient Persia, left numerous traces in all parts of Judaism, in its celestial mythology as represented by the angels, in its infernal mythology, and, finally, in the practice of the outward cult. Are we now to believe that its philosophy, that is, the Kabbalah, alone escaped this influence? Is such an opinion probable, when we know that the Kabbalistic tradition developed in the same manner, in the same time, and, like the oral law of the Talmudic tradition, it rests upon the same names? Far be it from us to content ourselves with a simple conjecture, no matter how well founded, on a subject of such a grave nature. We shall take up one by one all the essential elements of the Kabbalah, and show their perfect resemblance with the metaphysical principles of the religion of Zoroaster. This method of procedure, although not very learned, must appear at least as most impartial. 1. The part played in the Kabbalah by the Ein Sof, the infinite without name and without form, is given by the theology of the Magi to eternal time, Zervain Akarin, and, according to others, to limitless space. 662 We want to note right here that the term, space, or absolute place, mokom, has become with the Hebrews the very name of the divinity. Furthermore, this first principle, this only and supreme source of all existence, is only an abstract God, without direct action upon the beings, without active relation to the world, and consequently, without any appreciable form to us, for good as well as evil, light as well as darkness are still huddled together in his bosom. 663 According to the sect of the Zervanites, whose opinion has been conserved by a Persian historian, 664 The principle we just mentioned, Zervan himself, would be, like the crown of the Kabbalists, but the first emanation of the infinite light. 2. The memra of the Chaldean translators is easily recognized in the following words by which Ormuzd himself defines the Hanova, or the creative word, the pure, the holy, the speedy Hanova. I tell it to you, O wise Zoroaster. Was before the heavens, before the waters, before the earth, before the herds, before the trees, before the fire, the son of Ormuzd, before the pure man, before the Devis, before all the existing worlds, before all the good things. But the very same word Ormuzd created the world, and by it he acts and exists. Zend Avenue, Volume 2, page 138. But the word existed not only before the world, although, given by God, as the Zend books say, 665 it is eternal as he is. It takes the part of mediator between limitless time and the existences that flow from its bosom. It embraces the source and model of all perfection, and has the power to realize them in all beings. 666 What establishes, finally, its resemblance with the Kabbalistic word, is that it has a body and a spirit, that is to say, that it is the spirit and the word at the same time. It is the spirit, because it is no less than the soul of Ormuzd, as he himself expressly said, Zend Avenue, Volume 2, page 415, it is the word or the body, that is to say the spirit become visible, because it is at the same time the law and the universe. Zend Avenue, Volume 3, page 325, 595. 3. In Ormuzd we find something that resembles fully what the Zohar calls, person, or face, Partsuf. He, Ormuzd, is in fact the highest personification of the creative word, of that excellent word, of which his soul is made. It is in him also rather than in the highest principle, in the eternal time, that we are to look for the union of all the attributes ordinarily ascribed to God, and which make up his manifestation, or, in the language of the Orient, the most brilliant and purest light. In the beginning, say the sacred books of the Parsis, Ormuzd, elevated above everything, was with the supreme wisdom, with the purity and in the light of the world. This luminous throne, Merkaba, this place inhabited by Ormuzd, is the one called the primitive light. Zend Avenue, Volume 3, page 343. Like the celestial man of the Kabbalists, he combines in him the true knowledge, the highest intelligence, the greatness, the goodness, the beauty, the energy or the strength, the purity or the splendor. It is he, finally, who had created, or formed at least, and who nourishes all beings. 667 These qualities in themselves and their resemblance to the Sephiroth cannot, of course, lead us to any conclusion, but we cannot help noticing that they are all united in Ormuzd, whose role, in relation to infinity and to unlimited time, is the same as that of the Adam Kadmon in relation to the Ein Sof. Indeed, if we are to believe an already quoted historian, there existed among the Persians a very numerous sect in whose estimation Ormuzd was the divine will manifested in a highly resplendent human form. 668 It is also true that the Zend books say nothing of how Ormuzd brought forth the world, in what manner he himself and his enemies sprang from the bosom of the Eternal, and, finally, what constitutes the primitive substance of things. 669 But when God is compared to light, when the efficient cause of the world is subordinated to a higher principle, and the universe considered as the body of the invisible word, we must necessarily consider the beings as isolated words of that infinite light. We wish also to remark that the Gnostic pantheism is more or less connected with the fundamental principle of the theology of the Parsees. 674. According to the Kabbalistic belief, as well as according to the Platonian system, all beings of the world existed at first in a more complete form in the invisible world. Each one of them has in the divine thought its invariable model, which can come to light here below only through the imperfection of matter. This conception, wherein the dogma of pre-existence is mingled with the principle of the theory of ideas, is found also in the Zendavesta under the name of fair hour. The greatest Orientist of our days explains this word as follows: it is known that by fair hour, the Persians understood the divine type of each intelligently endowed thing, its idea in the thought of Ormuzd and the higher spirit that breathes in it and watches over it. This meaning is supported by the tradition as well as by the texts. 671. The interpretation of Orquitil-Duperin agrees perfectly with this one. 672, and we shall not cite all the passages of the Zendavesta that confirm it. We would rather point out a very remarkable coincidence on one particular point of this doctrine between the Kabbalists and the disciples of Zoroaster. We still recall that magnificent passage in the Zohar where the souls, about to be sent to earth, represent to God how they will suffer while away from Him, what misery and contamination awaits them in our world. Well then, in the religious traditions of the Parsees the Pharaohs make the same complaint, and Ormuzd answers them nearly as Jehovah answers those souls which are grieved over leaving heaven. He tells them that they were born for struggle, to combat evil and make it disappear from the creation, that they can only then enjoy immortality and heaven, when their task upon earth shall have been accomplished. 673. Think what advantage you will have when, in the world, I shall permit you to stay in bodies. Fight and make the children of Ahriman disappear. In the end I shall rehabilitate you in your first estate and you will be happy. In the end I shall set you again in the world, and you will be immortal, ever young and faultless. Zend Avenue, Volume 2, page 350. Another feature that reminds us of the Kabbalistic ideas is that the nations have their fair hours just as the individuals, and thus the Zendavesta often invokes the fair hour of Iran where the law of Zoroaster was recognized first. However, this belief, which we meet also in the Prophecies of Daniel, chapter X, 10 ff, was probably long since widely spread among the Chaldeans before their political and religious fusion with the Persians. 5. If the psychology of the Kabbalists has some resemblance with that of Plato, it has greater resemblance with that of the Parsecs, as represented in a collection of very old traditions which have been, for the most part, reproduced by Orquitil-Duperin in the Memoires de l'Académie des Inscriptions. Volume 38, pages 646 to 648. Let us first recall that according to the Kabbalistic theories there are in the human soul three powers, perfectly distinct one from another, which are united only during earthly life. On the highest level is the spirit proper, Neshama, the pure emanation of the divine intelligence, destined to return to its source, and unaffected by earthly contaminations. On the lowest level, immediately above matter, is the principle of motion and sensation, the vital spirit, Nefesh, whose task ends at the brink of the grave. Between these two extremes, finally, is the seat of good and of evil, the free and responsible principle, the moral person, Ruah. 674. We must add that several Kabbalists and some philosophers of great authority in Judaism have added to these three principal elements two others, one of which is the vital principle, Hiho, the intermediary power between the soul and the body. Apart from the principle of sensation, the other is the type, or, we may say, the idea which expresses the articular form of the individual, Wahida, Selam, Daugma. This form descends from heaven into the womb of the woman at the time of conception and leaves 30 days before death. During this period, of 30 days, it is replaced by a shapeless shadow. The theologic traditions of the Parsees set up precisely the same distinctions in the human soul. We easily recognize the individual type in the Pharaoh which, having existed in heaven in a pure and isolated state, is compelled, as we have seen above, to unite with the body. In no less evident manner do we find again the vital principle in the Djinn, whose part it is, as the author our guide says, to conserve the forces of the body and to maintain the harmony in all its parts. Like the Hiyah of the Hebrews, it takes no part in the evil of which man is guilty, it is but a light vapor that comes from the heart, and which must mix with the earth after death. The echo, on the contrary, is the highest principle. It is above evil, as the preceding principle is below it. It is a kind of light that comes from heaven, and which must return thither when our body is returned to the dust. It is the pure intelligence of Plato and of the Kabbalists, but restricted to the knowledge of our duties, to the provision of future life and to resurrection, in short, to moral consciousness. We finally come to the soul proper or the moral person, which is one, notwithstanding the diversity of its faculties, and which alone is responsible to divine judgment for our actions. 675 Another distinction, though much less philosophical but equally admitted by the Zen books, is the one which makes man the image of the world and which recognizes in his consciousness two opposite principles, two kedras, one, coming from heaven, leads us to good, while the other, created by Ahriman, tempts us to do evil. 676 These two principles which, nevertheless, do not exclude liberty of action, play quite a prominent role in the Talmud where they become the good and the evil desire, Yetzatav, Yetzahara, possibly also the good and the evil angel. 6. Even the conception of Ahriman, notwithstanding its purely mythological character, was preserved in the doctrines of the Kabbalah, for darkness and evil are personified in Samuel, just as the divine light is represented in all its splendor by the heavenly man. As to the metaphysical interpretation of this symbol, namely that the evil principle is matter, or, as the Kabbalists say, the shell, the last degree of existence, it is found, without straining the subject, in the sect of the Zadustians who established between the divine light and the kingdom of darkness the same relation as between the body and its shadow. 677 But another fact, more worthy of our attention, because not to be found elsewhere, is that we find in the oldest parts of the religious codes of the Parsis the Kabbalistic view that the Prince of Darkness, Samael, by losing half of his name, becomes at the end of days, an angel of light, and, together with all that was cursed, returns to divine grace. A passage in the Yajna reads, This unjust, this impure, this gloomy king who knows but evil, will say Avesta at the resurrection, and, fulfilling the law, he will establish it even in the dwelling of the damned, the Derwents. Zend Avenue, Volume 2, page 169. The Bundehesh adds that at the same time Ormuzd and the 7 first genii on one side, and Ahriman with an equal number of evil spirits on the other side, will be seen together offering a sacrifice to the eternal, Zervain Akarim. Zend Avenue, Volume 3, page 415. We shall add, finally, to all these metaphysical and religious ideas a very peculiar geographical system which is found with some slight variations in the Zohar and in the sacred books of the Parsis. According to the Zend Avesta, Volume 2, page 70, and the Bundehesh, Zend Avenue, Volume 3, page 363, the earth is divided into 7 parts, Keshvars, which are watered by just as many great rivers, and separated from one another by the water spilled in the beginning. Each of these parts form a world in itself and supports inhabitants of different nature. Some are black, some are white, these have their bodies covered with hair, like animals, the others differentiate themselves by some other more or less fantastic formation. Finally, only one of these great parts of the earth received the law of Zoroaster. Let us now have the view of the Kabbalists on the same subject. In quoting it, we shall confine ourselves to the role of a translator only. When God created the world, he stretched above us 7 heavens, and formed beneath our feet as many lands. He made also 7 rivers, and set up the week of 7 days. Now, as each of these heavens has its separate constellation and angels of a particular nature, so also have the lands here below. Placed one above the other, they are all inhabited, but by beings of different nature, as it was said of the heavens. Among the beings, some have 2 faces, some 4, and others but 1. They differ just as well in their color, some are red, some black, and some white. These have clothes, the others are naked like worms. If the objection be raised that all the inhabitants of the world descend from Adam, we ask if it is possible that Adam traveled in all these regions for the purpose of populating them with his children. How many wives did he have? But Adam lived only in that part of the earth which is the most elevated and which is enveloped by the higher heaven. 678 The only difference that separates this opinion from that of the Parsis is that instead of considering the 7 parts of the earth as natural divisions of the same surface, they represent them as enveloped one in another, like the layers of an onion, as the text says. These are, in their full simplicity and without any systematical arrangement, the elements that constitute the common foundation of the Kabbalah and the religious ideas brought forth under the influence of the Zend Avesta. No matter how numerous and how important they may be, we would still retreat before the deduction that follows from this parallel if we had not found also in the sacred books of the Parseks all the heavenly and infernal mythology, part of the liturgy and even some of the most essential dogmas of Judaism. Nevertheless, God forbid that we accuse the Kabbalists of having been but servile imitators, of having adopted strange ideas and beliefs without examination or, at least, without modification, and of having confined themselves to clothing them with the authority of the sacred books. As a general rule, there is no instance of a nation, no matter how strongly the influence of another nation may act upon it, giving up its true existence, the exercise of its inner faculties, and being content with a borrowed life, and if I may also say, with a borrowed soul. We cannot possibly consider the Kabbalah as an isolated fact, as accidental in Judaism. On the contrary, it is its heart and life. 679-4. While the Talmud took possession of all that relates to the outward practice and the material execution of the law, the Kabbalah reserved for itself exclusively the domain of speculation and the most formidable problems of the natural and revealed theology. It was able, besides, to arouse the veneration of the people by showing inviolate respect for their gross beliefs, and in giving them to understand that their entire faith and cult rested upon a sublime mystery. By carrying the principle of the allegorical method to its last consequences, the Kabbalah had no need of trickery to accomplish this. We have also seen to what rank it has been raised by the Talmud, and what influence it exerted upon popular imagination. The sentiments it once instilled have remained to the days nearest to us, for it was by depending upon the Kabbalistic ideas that the modern Bar Kochba, Sabbathai Zebi, had disturbed for a while all the Jews of the world. 680. The ideas also caused the liveliest agitation among the Jews of Hungary and Poland towards the close of the 18th century by giving birth to the sect of the Zoharites and Neo-Hasidim, and by leading thousands of Israelites into the bosom of Christianity. When we now consider the Kabbalah, per se, we cannot help seeing therein an immense advance upon the theology of the Zend-Avesta. Here, indeed, dualism is the cornerstone of the structure, although not as absolute as commonly thought, and although born as a principle in a religion which acknowledges one supreme being. Ormuzd and Ahriman alone exist in reality, with a divine character and with real power, while the eternal, that limitless time from which both of them sprang, is, as we said, a pure abstraction. With the desire to relieve him, the eternal, of the responsibility for evil, the management of the world was taken from him, and consequently all participation in good, nothing but a name with a shadow of existence was left to him. But this is not all. All ideas relating to the invisible world, all the great principles of the human mind in the Zend-Avesta, and in the later traditions connected with it, are still wrapped in a mythological veil through which they appear as visible realities and as distinct persons made in the image of man. The doctrine of the Kabbalists presents quite a different character. Here monotheism is the foundation, the basis and the principle of all. Dualism and all other distinctions of whatever nature exist only formally. God alone, God, one and supreme, is at once the cause, the substance and the intelligible essence, the ideal form of all that is. Only between being and not being, between the highest form and the lowest degree of existence is there an opposition, dualism. That one is light, this one is darkness. Darkness, therefore, is but a negation, and light, as we have shown several times, is the spiritual principle, the eternal wisdom, the infinite intelligence which creates all that it conceives, and conceives or thinks by its very existence. But if this be so, if it be true that at a certain height the being and the thought blend, then the great conceptions of the intelligence cannot exist in mind alone, then they do not represent mere forms from which abstractions are made at will, on the contrary, they have a substantial and an absolute value, that is to say, they are inseparable from the eternal substance. This is precisely the character of the Sephiroth, of the heavenly man, of the great and small face, in short, of all the Kabbalistic personifications which, as we see, differ greatly from the individual and mythological realizations of the Zend-Avesta. The frame, the outline of the Zend-Avesta, still remained the same, but the background completely changed its nature, and the Kabbalah offers, by its very birth, the peculiar spectacle of a mythology passing into the state of metaphysics under the very influence of religious sentiment. However, the system which was the fruit of that movement, does not belong as yet, notwithstanding such volume and depth, among the works where human reason makes free use of its rights and powers. Mysticism, per se, does not show itself there in the most elevated form, for it still remains chained to an external power, the revealed word. No doubt that this power is more apparent than real, undoubtedly also that allegory soon made of the sacred letter a compliant sign which expresses whatever one wishes, a docile instrument at the service of the mind and its most liberal inspirations. But it cannot be denied that such a procedure, whether due to deliberation or to sincere illusion, this art of shielding new ideas under some venerable text, is the sanctioning of fatal prejudice against true philosophy. Thus it is that the Kabbalah has a religious and a national character, although born under the influence of a strange civilization, and notwithstanding the pantheism that underlies all its doctrines. By taking refuge, first under the authority of the Bible and then under the oral law, it retained all the appearances of a theological system, and especially of a Jewish theology. Before admitting it, therefore, into the history of philosophy and humanity, those appearances had to be wiped out and the Kabbalah had to be shown in its true light, that is to say, as a natural product of the human mind. This course was accomplished, as we already said, slowly but surely, in the capital of the Ptolemies. There, for the first time, the Hebrew tradition stepped over the threshold of the sanctuary, and mingling with many new ideas, but losing none of their own substance, they spread into the world. Desiring to recover a property which they considered their own, the guardians of these traditions welcomed ardently the most noble results of the Greek philosophy and mingled them more and more with their own beliefs. The pretended heirs to the Greek civilization, on the other hand, became gradually accustomed to this mingling, and thought only of bringing it into an organized system where reason and intuition, philosophy and theology would be equally represented. Thus it was that the Alexandrian school developed that brilliant and profound summary of all the philosophical and religious ideas of antiquity. Thus is explained the resemblance, yes, I dare say, the identity we have found in all the essential points of Neoplatonism and of the Kabbalah. But the Kabbalah, having entered by this path the common ground of the human mind, was nevertheless transmitted among the Jews of Palestine in a small circle of the elite and was considered the secret of Israel. In this manner it was introduced into Europe, and in this manner it was taught until the publication of the Zohar. Here begins a new order of research, viz. What influence did the Kabbalah exert upon the Hermetic and mystic philosophy which attracted such attention from the beginning of the 15th to the end of the 17th century, of which Raymond Lullas may be considered the first, and Francis Mercurius van Helmont the last representative? This may be the subject of a second work that will be considered perhaps as a complement to the present work. We believe, though, we have attained the aim we have set with reference to the Kabbalistic system proper, and we have only to point out in a quick recapitulation the results which we believe we have attained. 1. The Kabbalah is not an imitation of the Platonic philosophy, for Plato was unknown in Palestine where the Kabbalistic system was founded. Furthermore, notwithstanding the several resembling traits which strike us at first glance, the two doctrines differ totally in the most important points. 2. The Kabbalah is not an imitation of the Alexandrian school. First, because it antedates the Alexandrian school, and secondly because Judaism has always shown a profound aversion to and an ignorance of Greek civilization even when it raised the Kabbalah to the rank of divine revelation. 3. The Kabbalah cannot be regarded as the work of Philo, although the doctrines of the philosophical theologian contain a great number of Kabbalistic ideas. Philo could not transmit these ideas to his Palestinian compatriots without at the same time initiating them into the Greek philosophy. Because of the nature of his mind, Philo was not capable of founding a new doctrine. What is more, it is impossible to find in the monuments of Judaism the least trace of his influence. Finally, Philo's writings are of more recent date than the Kabbalistic principles, the application as well as the substance of which we find in the Septuagint, in the Proverbs of Ben Sirach and in the Book of Wisdom. 4. The Kabbalah has not been borrowed from Christianity, for all the great principles upon which it stands antedate the coming of Christ. 5. The striking resemblances which we have found between this doctrine and the religious beliefs of the several sects of Persia, the numerous and odd relations which it presents to us with the Zendavesta, the traces that the religion of Zoroaster has left in all parts of Judaism, and the outward relations which existed between the Hebrews and their old teachers since the Babylonian captivity, force us to the conclusion that the materials of the Kabbalah were drawn from the theology of the ancient Persians. But we believe we have demonstrated at the same time that this alone did not destroy the originality of the Kabbalah, for the Kabbalah substituted the absolute unity of cause and substance for the dualism in God and in nature. Instead of explaining the formation of beings as an arbitrary act of two inimical forces, it presents them as divine forms, as successive and providential manifestations of the infinite intelligence. The ideas, finally, take in its bosom the place of realized personifications, and the mythology is supplanted by metaphysics. This seems to us to be the general law of the human mind. No absolute originality, but also no servile imitation from one nation and from one century to another. Whatever we may do to gain unlimited independence in the domain of moral science, the chain of tradition will always show itself in our boldest discoveries, and no matter how motionless we sometimes appear to be under the sway of tradition and authority, our intelligence paves the way, our ideas change with the very power that weighs them down, and a revolution is about to break loose.